Hello, welcome my dear students. In my previous video, I had just given an introductory note on environmental science and some of its important aspects as far as definition and its scope is concerned. Today, I will be talking to you about the environmental education and its various levels. Environmental education can be studied as environmental research, environmental literacy, environmental engineering, environmental empowerment, and lastly the environmentalism. Now all these aspects helps an individual to change his behavior to make it more eco-friendly and more responsible, which we call it as environmental responsible behavior. This is very important in order to just conserve the environment, in order to protect the environment and make it sustainable. What is more important for an individual is to change his attitude, his thinking and its behavior as far as environment is concerned. That kind of inculcation and cultivation of a behavior which becomes very friendly, which becomes very what you call nearer to the environment, then that we call it as environmental responsible behavior. On the whole of this environmental education put in gamut should help and promote each and every one of us, who are all the stakeholders, to change our behavior for the betterment of environment. Well, what's more important and what can motivate and change in each and every individual to become more responsible for the environment is what is known as the concept of environmentalism. Today, let me just talk about what is environmentalism. We all know the environment, and the literal meaning of ism is a system or a philosophy or a kind of political ideology. Now, any such kind of system or a philosophy or a political ideology which becomes a cause for protection of environment, conservation of environment or fight for the cause of the environment is the environmentalism. So, I would say that this particular concept is known as environmentalism, and let us now try to analyze where this particular concept of environmentalism originated. We all very well know that the consciousness of the environment is well established and known in our ancient literature and in our ancient philosophy, and in many religions. They have understood very well about this environment and they had that consciousness. The very modern concept of environmentalism evolved and had its origin in USA in 1960. Now, all this concept begins with a story of DDT. Let me just try to connect this particular story of DDT with the concept of environmentalism, which originated in USA in 1960. Now, all of you have heard of DDT. Popularly, it is known as an insecticide. It's an organic chemical compound. This particular DDT, chronologically, if you look into its origin, it was in 1873 invented in Germany by a German scientist. It was a synthetic organic compound. When it was invented, the scientists did not realize its significance or the potential as a chemical compound, what it could do. But later on in 1939, it was reinvented by, rather than reinvention, I would call it as rediscovered by a famous scientist. He was a doctor of Switzerland named Paul Hermann Muller. Paul Hermann Muller in 1939 rediscovers this DDT. A wonderful rediscovery of this DDT was demonstrated by him to the public that this particular DDT had a great potential to kill the insects. Therefore, it becomes an insecticide. He was the one who demonstrated to the world that DDT has got that immense potential to act as an insecticide against many insects, pests, germs, and so forth. In those days, the typhoid and malaria was one of the biggest what they call bane, and then it was pandemic, as how we today we see COVID. There is no cure for it because it is all vector borne, and many insects carried these diseases and disease carrying pathogens. Now, in those days, there was a need to control this disease. Until and unless you control this vector, there could not have been an end for this disease. And this particular DDT became a magic chemical and then wonder chemical, organic synthetic compound, which was demonstrated by the Paul Hermann Muller that this particular DDT can act against mosquitoes and many insects like gypsy moth and then housefly and many more such kind of insects. That means it had the potential to kill the insects, therefore it becomes an insecticide. This particular rediscovery and then the realization of this particular DDT acting as an insecticide fetched a Nobel Prize to Paul Hermann Muller in 1948. So, in 1939 he rediscovered and he showed to the world, and in 1948 he gets a Nobel Prize for his the work which showed a way to protect these diseases, protect the human beings from the diseases, and then controlling this insect vectors. So, ever since this DDT was rediscovered by Paul Hermann Muller, then in 1945 the American government a license to produce this DDT and gave an free what you call use of this DDT in civilian activities. Now, that this DDT was being widely used in public toilets, in public places, in for sanitations, and in hospitals, and so forth. So, that means the DDT started its era. Now, this particular DDT was manufactured by American Cyanamid company, and this company was given license by USA to manufacture DDT, and then since 1945 the DDT ruled the America. The people become very happy. They were so happy that the diseases like cholera, diseases like malaria, the plague and so forth, all of them vanished, and people thought that they are becoming so healthy and they are very happy and the life changed. But nobody thought about the repercussions of this particular DDT, what it had on the environment. The people never thought about this because they were only worried about curing the diseases which troubled and which inflicted the world then. And for almost more than 20 years the people never realized and thought about what's happening in the environment, in the surrounding. then comes from the what you call the bolt from the heaven, a lady called as Richeal Carson, and marine biologist in some part of America, where she was just working as a passionate researcher, and she started observing a lot of changes in her surrounding where she lived. The plants were suffering, the animals were suffering, they were all showing some kind of mutations, they were showing some kind of abnormalities, and the trees used to were shedding their leaves, and the flowers never formed the fruits and seed setting, and then the young ones which hatched from the eggs were all mutated and showing different kind of abnormalities. The sheep or the goat, the young ones which born, were lame. And suddenly these observations which the Richeal Carson made struck to her mind that something has happened to the environment which she didn't notice earlier. Her observations were focused on what that might have entered into the environment other than which is present in the environment. That means to say something which was not needed, an unwanted thing has entered into the environment, and this particular unwanted thing which has entered into the environment, she observed and pointed it and said it was this particular DDT. Now this DDT, if we look into its properties of as a chemical, it's a synthetic organic chemical. When it enters the environment, it never degrades, what we call the biological degradation. DDT never gets degraded biologically, and the mode of the entry of DDT into the environment is through the suspension, sprays, or direct spray as a dust. Either of these two applications need not have to be done repeatedly. Once done, it kills the target population but remains in the environment for a long time. That means to say it persists in the environment and its component for a long time. This is one of the important properties of the DDT. It never breaks down. The second thing is that this particular DDT, when it enters in the environment into its various components, it moves from one component to the another component, from abiotic to biotic component. And this particular movement of this DDT from one component to another component takes place through what is known as the food chain cycle. So any components for that matter which is being contaminated with this DDT, when it is entering into the another component of the environmental system, it may be an biotic to biotic, then it enters into the system and accumulates. This has got a power of accumulating in the tissue of the plants or animals, and this particular DDT is highly soluble in fat and it is less soluble in water or insoluble in water. So therefore, when it enters into the food chain cycle, when it is going from one component to another component, the biological components, so it just gets into that particular components, any of its organ which has got fat, and accumulates there. In the long run, when this happens, the accumulation continues to carry on, and this particular accumulation is called as bioaccumulation. So, the DDT, first what it does is it accumulates in the fatty substance of an biotic component, and then which leads to what is known as bioaccumulation. This particular bioaccumulation in the long run creates a kind of what is known as enlargement of this particular tissue or an organ within the biotic component, which we call it as biomagnification. This particular biomagnification leads to enlargement of an organ. It can lead to an hypertrophy, hyperplasia, and then accumulation of this DDT, which would have taken place in a smaller quantity in the beginning, which would lead to an huge quantity that which creates the organ or a tissue to enlarge, and which becomes a tumor. This is what we call it as cancer or cancerous cells. So, that means to say this particular DDT in the long run, when it goes through bioaccumulation and then leads to biomagnification, that particular organ turns out to be what is known as tumor or tumorous cells. So, ultimately the organism dies. This is lethality. This is the effect of DDT. So, when it remains in the environment, in any of its abiotic components, either in the air or water or the soil, first it gets suspended in the air, and then obviously it comes down to the soil through what you call mixing with water or the moistness, and when it comes down to the soil, then it gets percolated into the soil through the water, and then the soil gets contaminated, the water gets contaminated, and once when it is contaminated with this DDT, DDT is biologically non-degradable. It lives in the abiotic components forever, and this particular persistency of this particular component in these components are called as persistent organic pollutants. So, that means to say this is the one example. The compound which was a persistent organic pollutant was DDT, and this whole thing, the story of DDT was encapsulated in a beautiful what I call evocative prose written by Richeal Carson in her book named Silent Spring. She took nearly 4 years to write this book. Her book was compilation of painstaking facts, figures, observations, which became a scientific fiction. In 1960, Richeal Carson publishes this book, Silent Spring, and this reaches all parts of the world. In span of 2 years, this particular book, Silent Spring, becomes one of the best international seller. There is a great demand for this book all over the world, and the people not only in America and every parts of the world started just reading this book, and then they became the follower of Richeal Carson. They all endorsed the opinion of Richeal Carson. After reading this book, the people living in America, irrespective of the state and place, started making the observations what Richeal Carson had compiled in her book, and they tried to tally them, and they found it was true. Whatever Richeal Carson saw, she saw in her place where she lived, and then the observations that she compiled in her book, the same thing happened everywhere. The people where they lived, after reading this book, and they started comparing with the changes that's taking place in the environment in their surrounding. This is which becomes the milestone in the modern environmental movement. So, it gives a kickstart in every part of the world. The people starts just following Richeal Carson and asks Richeal Carson a lot of clarifications about this, and then they start communicating with Richeal Carson, and then they encouraged, they supported Richeal Carson to fight against this use of DDT in America. This was the beginning of the movement. In 1962, the movement started in America. It geared up all over the world, and everybody started protesting against the use of DDT, and they said that we don't want DDT, but we want environment. We want environment to be protected carefully. We want the environment to be conserved. We don't want any such kind of toxic substance to enter our environment and remain as a persistent organic pollutant. The people became aware. Therefore, the Richeal Carson in the modern era becomes the first environmentalist. And she, as an individual, fights against the multi-billion business of manufacturing DDT, that particular company, American Cyanamide Company. When she started protesting against this and created the movement all over the world, a lot of followers were there for her throughout the world, and there was a strong movement and then protest against this manufacturing of DDT in USA. Nevertheless, this particular big billion-dollar business capitalist kept quiet. They said that Richeal Carson had no right to talk about the chemistry of DDT because as such Richeal Carson do not have the competency to talk about DDT, because they said she was just a marine biologist. What a marine biologist can talk about DDT? If the people listen to Richeal Carson and stop using DDT, then again the people would go back to dark ages. That means to say, again facing the same kind of diseases what the people were suffering in past 40s and 50s. And this is how the anti-protest was made by the American Cyanamide Company. They also created a kind of movement against Richeal Carson. But there was a big support for Richeal Carson, and all over the world they started telling that the findings meticulously reported in the Silent Spring had a great validity, and they wanted DDT to be banned. So then the American government, heeding to the pressure of the public, then the President of America, John F. Kennedy, in 1970 constitutes a technical committee to look into the details of the book and investigate what the findings and the observations and the compilations has been made by the Richeal Carson is true or not. The committee constituted by the American government in 1970 submits a report in 1972. So, in 1972, the committee says that whatever the findings and then the report that is made by Richeal Carson, the scientific observations in her book Richeal Carson, is 200% right. And they said that the DDT is a culprit, and the use of DDT is culpability, and it should not be allowed to use in America. It's a wonderful finding, and that report strengthened the hands of John F. Kennedy. And then John F. Kennedy in 1972 bans DDT and orders to close the American Cyanamide Company. It's a wonderful decision taken by John F. Kennedy and the American government. Since then, American government bans DDT, not just banning the DDT, it just makes an order that no such chemical compound should be manufactured in America and also should not be used in America. In 1972, the DDT was banned and the use of DDT was stopped in America. Unfortunately, after 1972, many of the poor countries, underdeveloped countries, developing countries, the Asian countries, the African countries started using DDT. Very unfortunate. Pretty well known that DDT was banned in America. The American cyanamide company, which had piled up huge quantity of DDT, they just gave DDT to all these countries on subsidized price, to the countries like African, the Asian, the developing and underdeveloped nations. Then there was a need for this kind of chemical to kill the insects, to check the vector spread, and therefore it was a need. The poor countries just wanted it, and since then we see that DDT is being rampantly used, though it is banned in many of the countries. Later on in 2000, in the Stockholm Conference on the Persistent Organic Pollutants, the declaration was made to ban DDT and not to use DDT and many more such DDT-like compounds, more than 11. And it made a resolution. But despite of such resolutions which were made in that conference were not taken back by or carried back for their homes in countries like Africa, Kenya and many Asian countries, because they needed DDT, because the DDT was the only magic chemical compound which could kill these insecticides. No doubt that DDT would cause these kind of what I call ill effects on human beings and as well as the environment. But immediate need was to just cure the disease instantly, check the vectors, kill the vectors which were what I call spreading the diseases. So other than DDT, nothing else was available. Not only DDT, like DDT compounds, DDT-like compounds. So the effects of DDT would take a very long time to manifest this kind of disorders in human beings as well as the plants or animals, what we call it as bioaccumulation or biomagnification. The bioaccumulation and biomagnification takes a long time. By the time that if you neglect the diseases or the controlling these diseases, that would kill more people than the people who would be affected with the ill effects of DDT. That was their argument. Therefore, even today, we are not able to just completely ban this DDT. Many countries, though it is being banned, but still it is being used. And we have many such compounds like DDT in the market. And now, this is the story which tells that the DDT was the first culprit which became a persistent organic pollutant and then destroyed the environment. And this particular DDT paved way to the environmentalism, and Richeal Carson was the modern environmentalist who fought against this DDT single-handed, and hats off to her. Thank you very much. In the next video, I will be talking to you about some of the environmental problems with videos. Thank you very much. Thank you.